What's happening, Bills Mafia, combat sports fans everywhere? Ryan Thomas here for another episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I am joined by an awesome guest. I am super pumped up to have Colin Crandall on the show. Colin Crandall, the host of the MMA Power Hour. So, a little bit of a curveball for you guys watching YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. The intro was a Buffalo Bills intro. You guys know this is mostly a Bills podcast, but every once in a while I like to throw an MMA wrinkle into things, get an MMA guest on the show. And I reached out to Colin on Twitter, and Colin is more than willing to grace us with his presence today. Colin, what's going on, my man?
All good, Ryan. I'm really happy to be here with you, man. Heard a lot of great things about you. I love how your show looks. You're another great voice guy like me, so I always like to chop it up with another guy with a great voice. And yeah, excited to be on your show and share my thoughts and my world of MMA and happy to be a guest on this great show.
Thank you, Colin. So, folks, we got a lot to discuss, Colin and I. Colin has been hosting the MMA Power Hour for quite some time now, right, Colin? And what got you, started in terms of covering mixed martial arts? Because MMA has had its own meteoric rise in its own right. It's unlike anything I've ever seen in terms of a sport that was once basically blacklisted to being a sport that is now in the MMA, not only MMA mainstream, but in the sports mainstream, as you've seen it grow in the peaks and valleys. And when it was, kind of the sport that nobody wanted to admit they were a fan of, now everybody wants to be a fan of mixed martial arts, right? So give me some background on how you got started, covering the sport of mixed martial arts.
Absolutely happy to do so. And yeah, our show's been going for about 6 years. And if I would have thought about it sooner, I would have done it sooner. I've always been a huge MMA fan. If I can get a frog out of my throat, excuse me, guys, what happens? You get old like me. So yeah, happy to tell you that I was a big boxing fan. I'm so old. I never want anyone to know exactly how old, so I'm not going to give a number, but you can kind of maybe guess. Some people think I look 10 years old, younger than my age. So maybe add that. Anyway, so go back in the time with me in the time machine before the first UFC in 1993. And I was young, I will admit. I'm not that old, but I was big boxing fan, watching with my dad and my uncle. And then I started to watch a little bit on my own, even though before. Anyway, so always was big into combat sports. And not only did I like boxing, but in the 80s, you started to see kickboxing under the banner of full contact karate. And it used to come on at weird times of the night and on a Sunday. And they basically made it kind of the redheaded stepchild of sports programming. And whenever I could see it was going to be on, I would watch it. And there was no DVR. I think there was VCRs, but nevertheless, I wanted to be watching it live. And it was an organization called PKA, Professional Karate Association, and run by a former karate fighter, Joe Corley. And they had guys like Rick the Jet Rufus, who, of course, is the older brother of Duke Rufus, who's an MMA trainer. And both of them former karate champions. Rick was actually more prolific in the kickboxing world than Duke. Duke, a more prolific MMA trainer for sure. But I would watch that, and they were wearing long pants, and they had to wear kind of rubber type of shoes at first. And, you didn't want to get anyone's toenails, slicing anyone's face up, so you had kind of rubber shoes. And it was exciting action. This is back in the days when you had a guy named Bad Brad Hefton, a heavyweight who was like he was as a side job, he was a bodyguard for like different rock groups, and big guy, like 6'3", he was about 225, which was fairly heavy back then. And his thing was that his manager would hypnotize him to get him to just completely take whatever pain he had to take and just like stand in the fire and continue to throw. And I remember one time he got his jaw broken and he seemed to not really be aware of what was going on. He was like Mr. Berserker. I remember they used to show clips of him and they say, Bad Brad Hefton from Rockford, Illinois is an amazing kid. And he'd be going like this, just squeezing his neck and his and I remember one time they said, Brad, can you do your Clint Eastwood, Dirty Harry impression. That was his key. You go, do you feel lucky, punk? Right. So I love that. I immediately love that. And then they started to show some random stuff in the 90s, like Sandshu. Kung Lee was involved in a sports called Sandshu. Shout out to Kung Lee. I've interviewed him several times. And in the early days of me interviewing, Kung was actually really helpful in me kind of feeling more in charge of my show and feeling more confidence. And I never forgot that because I had some guests that were helpful. Already I knew what I was talking about, and I had done things in the media, but I wasn't really knowledgeable that much about interviewing and having people on a show. And I wanted to tread lightly on the and be super respectful of all my fighter guests. And I remember talking to Kung before the show. And I was asking him about what it's okay for him to, to talk about and which subject would be all right, if there's anything. And he said, Colin, he said, it's your show. He said, I'm here because I respect you. I've seen the shows that you've done, and you came at me in a really good way. And he said, it's your show. And I said, I know. I said, I appreciate that. And I said, I just don't want to feel like I'm stepping on my guests who are more well-known than me. And he said, as long as you're respectful, he said, if you ask a question that a prominent fighter doesn't want to answer, we have a voice to say, I'm not going to answer that. And he said, so, just realize you're in charge. This is your show, and you're able to take the reins and take the lead no matter how famous a fighter you have on. And that really helped me. Like from then on, the confidence I had was amazingly different, and I felt a lot more comfortable. So Kung Lee was instrumental in helping me to kind of get to be the relaxed, fun guest host, and having that connection that I have with guests since then. So Sandshu came on. Then there was another sport called US Shidokan Open. Sorry for the voice, man. I didn't expect it to be this bad. Let me take an actually sip here.
You're good. You're good.
Thank you. Anyway, US Shidokan Open. You guys got to YouTube this, because if you're under 40, probably 45, you won't know about this. It was a sport that was mixed fighting, but in different rounds. In the first round, you would fight a guy, and it would be bare knuckles, wearing a gi, only striking, but no strikes to the head. Then in the second round, you would have to fight the guy in grappling, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, submissions, no striking. And in the third round, you'd glove up, and it was a kickboxing match, and you could kick and punch to the head and anywhere you wanted. And so it was a really interesting concept, I think, especially for the 90s. And they would have some really tough guys. And some guys were better at the striking. Some guys were better in the bare knuckle area, but no strike to the head. Some guys excelled in the grappling. I remember there was a Polish guy, I forgot his name, who just kept on beating everybody. And it was like everyone's after this big Polish guy. It's like, someone beat this guy, or he's driving me nuts. It's here he is, Uzanowski or whatever, And I'd be like, someone beat him, come on, someone beat him, come on. And so I love that. And then I remember when I was at a chiropractor's office, because I had been doing traditional karate, and a guy I know his son was like 10 years younger than me, and this guy was like 12, 15 years older than me, the father. He was a chiropractor. And I was there one day, I think it was 1991, and he said, and he had a black belt in 2 different styles. And he said, Colin, let me show you something that I've been learning in some interesting Brazilian guy's garage. And I said, all right. And he said, here, let me get a grip on this here. And I forget what submission he put on me at first. And I'm like, what the hell is that? And he said, yeah. He said, this is a submission hold from Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Because you remember in the early days, it was not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it was Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And so he said, yeah. He said, there's this unique guys. It's a bunch of brothers that I'm training with. And I'm like, this is crazy shit, man. And he said, yeah. He said, let me get you. He said, I'm going to get you a couple of videotapes called Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in Action 1 and 2. And it was basically home camera, or what they used to call camcorder footage from anywhere from the 50s, 60s, primarily 70s and 80s, right? And I watched them when I was like, holy shit, what the hell am I looking at? And I said, this is that crazy hold that he put me in. And he showed me a few more holds after that. Like every other session, he'd show me something. And so about a year and a half later, he said, guess what? The Gracies are going to have a no holds barred fighting event. It's going to be the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And I said, where are they going to get that sanctioned? Not anywhere in this country, right? And he said, no, they're going to go over to Denver, which doesn't have an athletic commission governing combat sports. And I said, well, I guess I can get away with it there. And so I had a copy of the press kit. We used to call it a Xerox copy because everyone had a machine was Xerox. That shows my age. So I actually had a copy of the press kit before UFC 1 for that event. And I was one of the few people that knew what was going to happen. I knew Hoist was going to take these people out to deep water and drown. No, I had no doubt.
The only fear,
thanks. The only fear I had is when I saw Ken Shamrock, and as much thicker as he looked. Hoist was a couple inches taller, but they were a similar age, and Ken was a lot more muscular. Ken later admitted he did a lot of steroids, but there was no ban on it. It was not illegal. They didn't really want to talk about it then, but there was no rule saying you couldn't in early no-holds-barred fighting. And I just realized I did like a 5-minute monologue. I'm sorry about that.
No, not at all. That was honestly, that was riveting. It set the stage for what, my next few questions are in regards to the UFC and the sport as we know it today. I mean, I'll provide just a little bit of my short but sweet, wow, what is this moment? My dad was a massive fan. I was pretty young. I couldn't exactly watch it at that time and understand it. 4 or 5 years old, back in the UFC 1, 2, and 3, people would go out. They'd rent the VHS tape, Blockbuster, that existed.
Yep.
They'd go out or Video Factory or wherever it was, and my dad would rent the pay-per-views when they'd come out on VHS. He'd know what would happen, but he would want to see it because it was such a weird time. People didn't really know what it was. It was kind of,
right.
Buried on pay-per-view. Wasn't really much of a pay-per-view force at that time.
No reporting, no sports reporting. We're talking about
no sports reporting, no social media, of course. So, as it grew, it had that kind of downward spiral, and then Zuffa came in, the Fertitta brothers, Dana White, and just like the majority of the American pop culture that was able to catch on to the sport, I really started watching it 2003, 2004, when I was 11, 10, 11, 12, 13, and then it just took off. And the late, great Stephan Bonnar and Forrest Griffin, that tough finale fight, as well as the rivalry of the coaches between Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture, was really what got it started for me. Shortly thereafter, I always say this, I want your take on this, Colin. As much as the first season of The Ultimate Fighter was such a booming success, without that fight between Stephan Bonnar and Forrest Griffin, the sport wouldn't be what it is today. A lot of people say that, but it's true. The comeback season with Matt Serra, winning that season, and then getting a title shot off of that season and pulling off one of the greatest upsets ever and beating George St. Pierre, that to me was another moment that catapulted the sport of what was possible, that no fight was a guarantee, that any fight could end with one guy 10-1 underdog, 14-1 underdog, whatever he was, winning that fight. That started to create the, oh my God, anything can happen in this sport. What was the moment for you when you realized that this was a legitimate juggernaut of a sport and that it was evolving and that people were starting to recognize it evolving, from celebrities to just the average sports fan?
Very good question, Ryan. I appreciate that. And I was going to say, yes, so many fans got to be huge fans from that first season of The Ultimate Fighter, tough as they call it, TUF, and that Bonnar and Griffin fight. Stephan Bonnar, I interviewed a few times, and he was actually a good friend of a friend of mine. Some people misread that or think I'm saying he was a good friend of mine. No, he wasn't a good friend. he had the actual same birthday as I have. I was actually a few years older than Bonner even, but God bless him. Really good dude, and he'll be missed and remembered. It's funny because it used to be the guys that were like compared to me. It used to be the really young guys that got to be into the sport from that. Now you guys are like 37, 38, 40. You're still the young guys compared to me. But I remember when it was like the guys that back then, they were like 19, 20, 21, and they got into it. And I was like, oh yeah, you young guys are coming into it. But I still respected it. And now really it's like you guys can actually say to the younger guys, yeah, I got in back when it was that amazing Bonner. Like, you did? That must have been great. You were there then to watch it, right? But so the question being, when did I have a feeling it was going to really take off? Is that what you? So
yep.
So being so big into combat sports, as I mentioned, I was when I was told they were going to do that by that friend of mine, and I had already been aware and learned several submission holds. He always offered me to come to class, but I lived far away, and I either didn't have the time or the money or both when I was young. But I would learn a few submission holds, and I got to be really, especially after watching those 2 videotapes. So I was super excited, as you can probably imagine. I was super excited, and in the first UFC, there was some exciting stuff. There were a few things that were a little bit disappointing, and the ease in which Hoist beat all of his opponents, it wasn't disappointing, but I know that a lot of people that saw that first match were like, wow, what the hell is this? People that didn't know, like I had known for 2 years about grappling and jiu-jitsu were like, their head exploded. But those of us that knew and that were hoping to see like an amazingly electrifying event, save for a few moments, UFC number 1 wasn't it. So I was a little bit concerned. UFC 2, and for those of you that don't know, one of the weird things about UFC 2, back in those days, UFC didn't have much money. And so they would buy pay-per-view time, and it was a finite period of time. It was 3 hours. There wasn't any prelims televised. It wasn't like now where we're so blessed where we have a 7 to 9 hour day on a Saturday of watching fights. It was 3 hours, and it was a tournament. You didn't know who you knew who you were fighting in the first round, but then you'd have to fight about 40 minutes later if you won, and then about 40 minutes later if you won that fight. And so UFC 1 went off without a hitch. I think it finished well within the 3 hour block. UFC 2, instead of an 8-man elimination tournament, they wanted to up the ante, and they made it a 16-man elimination tournament. After they decided to do it on like a little bit of a tape delay, and after 2 or 3 of the early fights went really long, they were like, okay, we're in trouble. This is not gonna fit in the pay-per-view. So they actually, when we joined the show, they said, okay, guys, we've actually had 3 of the first round matches already. Let's show you guys some clips of those matches, and we're going to take you to the 4th first round match with Hoist Gracie. And we're like, wait a second, why is this pay-per-view starting? We missed 3, but they showed us to us, and they showed Gracie. And this second one was the first matchup where Big John McCarthy was in. For some people that don't know, the first referee was a Brazilian referee who was a black belt, and he may even have been a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. But Rorion Gracie and WOW Enterprises, WOW, was in there under the guidance of Robert Meyerowitz and Art Davey, right? And basically, there's Rorion looking amazing, the Bill Gates of Jiu-Jitsu in his suit and bow tie, and he had told this Brazilian referee, these fights aren't to be stopped. The only way this fight stopped is if someone's corner throws a towel in or they're unconscious, or if they tap out. Yeah, if they tap out. No other stopping is going to be allowed, even if someone's getting their bobbleheaded. If no towel comes in or if no tapping is done, no fight is being stopped. So you get to the first fight ever, and a lot of people have seen this, and I still remember. I start feeling goosebumps on my arm because I knew, as I told you, way more than most what was going to come. But without Hoist in the match, who knew these guys? And I didn't know what was going to come from them. So you had Gerard Gordeau, who was a Dutch kickboxer that I think was close to 40, and he came out and did something like that, which almost looked like a Heil Hitler thing, which it wasn't. To my understanding, it was some Dutch kickboxing greeting, almost like Olympians will bow. It's almost like this, And but that got some hate later on, and I do believe, and I sure hope that was what they said it was, a Dutch kickboxing. So he was like 6'5", 225, older guy, but a very seasoned kickboxer. And apparently he was a guy who had a lot of street fights early on in Holland. So he was a rugged guy. Didn't know much about grappling. The guy who he fought turns out to have been kind of a ringer. The guy is in Hawaii, American guy named Taylor Wiley. However, they said that doesn't sound scary enough. Taylor Wiley sounds like you're just a regular American guy. You're this 400-pound, bald-headed, 6-foot-tall guy. Can you be called anything else? And they said, well, my Hawaiian name is Taylor Tuli. They said, that's it, Taylor Tuli. And they said, you're this amazing sumo champion. The guy had like a few sumo matches on the lowest level possible, but was a tough guy. And so the match starts. Wiley, a.k.a. Tuli, knew he didn't want to be striking with a 6'5", high-level world-class or close to world-class kickboxer. So he started to bull rush him in hopes to get a hold of him and get him to the ground. And his thought was, I'm going to bum rush this guy or bull rush this guy, and I'll push him all the way back to the fence. I'll grab him and take him on the ground and start beating the shit out of him. And unfortunately, as he started bull rushing him with his head like this, Gordeau was popping his head down like that, as we all know. And then he went into the fence. Gordeau spun out, stepped back, and kicked him in the mouth and hit him bare knuckles right in the eye socket. And the commentators were Kathy Long, who I met in person, who was one of the badass women kickboxers of all time, champion. Bill Superfoot Wallace, who was a point karate champion and one of the early kickboxing champions, who was in a Chuck Norris movie and a legend in the 60s and 70s, and football legend Jim Brown. And when the kick landed, Kathy Long said somebody just lost some teeth. And when I met her in person, the tooth flew right on their commentary table. And so there's Tuli or Wiley sitting on the ground, his eyes full of blood, his mouth is full of blood, and the referee's like, hang on a second. And Rorion Gracie's like, hey, what? Hang on, what? What are you doing? Fight. And the referee's like, no, wait a second. I gotta, and, bless the referee's heart, no one had seen anything like this except for in Brazil. And I think the referee was like, look, I don't want someone to be killed here under my watch. And so there was a lot of confusion with Rorion saying, let him fight. I told you, fight. There's no tapping out. There's no towel. You fight if you're not unconscious. And he's not. And so confusion reigned for about 5 minutes. And the commentators were saying, I think this fight's about to restart. And then eventually one of Wiley's brothers came in and was like, come on, no, that's not. So that was interesting. And that was the first matchup. The rest of the matches were interesting. In number 2, they had Big John McCarthy because Rorion was so angry at the Brazilian referee for having stopped that fight. And so they brought in McCarthy, who I think was a brown or black belt under Rorion Gracie at that time. And he was a tactical trainer, I think, with the LAPD or Orange County PD or something. The interesting thing that a lot of people don't know is that he told John McCarthy, under no circumstances are you to stop these fights unless someone is unconscious, tapping out, or the towel is thrown in. And he said, I'm not going to have a misunderstanding like with my Brazilian brother. Do you understand? You're not stopping any of these fights. And, McCarthy was like 25 years old, and Horian was like 35 years old. He was his teacher. He looked him in the eyes and he's like, yeah, I'm not stopping these fights. And that's why in that tournament, you see John McCarthy frequently pointing to the corner and saying, watch your fighter, watch your fighter, watch your fighter. And because he knew he couldn't do anything. And so those fights were exciting. So a couple people got the brakes beaten off of them pretty badly. And after that fight, John McCarthy went to Horian and said, I'll never referee another one of these. If I can't, I have to be able to stop the fight. Because he said, yeah. And he said people weren't quick enough to throw the towel in the people's corner. And I'm not going to, I'll never be involved in something like this again, where I have to be begging people's corner to watch their fighter, something like that, So then Gracie acquiesced, and I was like, all right, okay. But I think I was really excited. They used to have a disclaimer on the broadcasts, a warning saying this is a violent combat. If this is something that you don't feel you're going to be comfortable watching, you may want to not watch the following broadcast. And they would even have the commentators say that. Bruce Beck, I remember, would say, this is not an exhibition. This is real, brutal combat. And in the early days, anything went. There was no eye gouging, and there was no fish hooking in the mouth, and there was a gentleman's agreement. You're not going to bite anyone. Although Gordeau bit Hoist Gracie as Gracie was taking him down in the finals of the first match. That's why Hoist held the choke on so long, and the Brazilian referee had to peel his arms off. Gordeau also blinded, pretty much took out a guy's eye. Not a very honorable fighter in Gerard Gordeau. But what he did to a guy's eye was not in that UFC, but in a subsequent fight. But I was very excited about it. I was upset that there was no talk on ESPN or anywhere about it, though, and that concerned me. And I would tell people about it. They'd say, "What the hell are you talking about?" And I would tell them, and hardly anyone knew. But there was some gear available, full contact fighter headgear, and then AMC Pancration with Matt Hume and Josh Barnett headgear. And I would wear that. And if you'd see someone else wearing that, you'd be like, hey, dude, you're into that fighting, or are you a fighter or what? And you'd either be a fighter if you were a fighter. You say, no, I'm not a fighter, but, I love this. I'm training, and I'm a big fan of it. I had hope for it. But when the big protest came and it was pulled off pay-per-view and you could only watch it on Dish or DirecTV, I was concerned. But when when Zuffa took over, I had a lot of hope, and I think it was right around the Ultimate Fighter days where the momentum got so big. But I always believed in it. It was always the chess match of combat sports as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, and I completely agree. That's so fascinating, that story that you told pretty much created or started what became Big John McCarthy's entire referee career.
Yep.
And he's one of the pioneers of mixed martial arts as a referee. I think he's the best referee in combat sports history. Maybe I'm jumping the gun saying that. I don't think so. I mean, some of the best fights I've ever seen, some of the best moments in fights where you think, is someone going to stop this? The fact that, let's just go to this one fight, which is my favorite fight of all time, Robbie Lawler, Rory McDonald, Part 2, Big John the referee for that one. He could have stopped that 45 times over, and I'm so thankful that he didn't. So there's moments where a ref should have possibly stopped a fight, and he didn't, and it made a great fight. Then there's some times lately where refs step in and you say, they're just getting started. What are we doing here? What's going on? So that is an amazing story in terms of the early days of the sport, and how Big John kind of put his foot in and said, hey, I'm only allowing this to happen once. I'm only going to be allowed to be told what to do this one event, and then I'm going to call the fights my way as a ref. That's Man, that's riveting.
Yeah,
You
and they
mentioned,
embraced it. Sorry to interrupt you, but and from then
yeah,
on, they actually embraced it. And he would say, fighter safety is, he was a big
number
man at like
one.
6'4" and like 250, big, strong
Yep.
guy. And yeah, and so they embraced that after and he was one of the best referees, arguably the best in the game.
Definitely, definitely, and you left off on the Zuffa era, and I mean I think there has been so many superstars that have been in the sport that have come and gone. Anderson Silva, George St. Pierre, Matt Hughes. I could go on and on. There's been so many, and each one of them kind of encapsulated that era of the sport and raised the bar for the sport. Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Randy Couture. You can go on and on. Brock Lesnar, even you could throw in there as far as somebody that took the sport to another level in his own right. Right now, though, we're at a point in the sport's history where it is in the mainstream. Everybody knows about it. A lot of people like it. The people that don't, they're finding a way to watch it, whether they're going to their friend's house that watches it, whether they're going out on a Saturday night. Saturday night, almost every single week, there's a pay per view. It seems like there's,
Or
more,
at least UFC fight cards. Some are
or at
fight
least
nights that are
UFC.
free, and some are
Right.
pay per views. But yeah, there's the UFC almost every Saturday. Yeah.
Every Saturday, pay per view every month, fight night and or event seems like every single week. So yeah, definitely. And what's amazing about that, I should say, is that right now there's been some stars that have actually fallen on some hard times. Israel Adesanya lost his last fight, which he was winning that fight. John Jones hasn't fought in 3 years. The last time John Jones fought, COVID, wasn't even a factor, wasn't even a
Right.
thought yet. Conor McGregor has had his ups and downs, and he's been relatively inactive the last 5 6 years. I'd like to talk to you about that in regards to just the way the sport is now. For as much success as it has had, and it's finally reached that precipice of one of the big sports that everybody seems to really like nowadays. It has a few, detractors, of course, but it seems like now more than ever, people are really tuning into it. What is your take on the state of the sport today? What is something that maybe you love about the sport today in terms of the state of it, or something that maybe you would like to see ultimately fixed and or changed over the next 5 to 10 years?
Very, very good questions. I think the sport has maybe passed its peak of popularity by maybe a decade, but I don't think it's lost a tremendous amount of steam. I think what makes the sport interesting is having different organizations. The only thing that would make it even more interesting is if the organizations would actually have their champions fight each other. But that's hardly ever been the case in any combat sport over the years. In boxing, it is, because boxing is set up different. For those that don't know, boxing, you have sanctioning bodies. I was a big boxing fan for years. I've only occasionally looked in on boxing the last 15 years. Last time I looked, WBA, WBC, IBF were the biggest, and then WBO. I think one of them has fallen by the wayside since then, and there's another one that's somewhat big. But the bottom line is you have these sanctioning bodies, which are not the promoters. And then you have a set of these big time promoters. So, like, Bob Arum or Oscar De La Hoya with Golden Boy will set up a deal that his WBC champion will be defending his title, and then his other guy will be challenging for the IBF title on that same card, maybe. Although it seems like a lot of actually that probably couldn't be. It seems like each card will only have events for a certain sanctioning body, but because it's all separated like that, you will, with some frequency, with some regularity, actually have a champion face a champion. They don't like to do it, and the sanctioning body, even though they're not a promoter, would love for their guy to win because it makes it look like their organization was better. But there's not that much ego as much as there was with promoters. With MMA, it's a promoter has his own promotion. Dana White's the president, not the owner, but the president. Endeavor Group is the owner of the UFC. Chatri Sityodtong is the owner of One Championship. I know that former great kickboxing great Sugar Ray Sefo is a shareholder and the president of PFL. I don't know the exact owner. It used to be Carlos Silva, but he has since left. And then with Bellator, it's Scott Coker. And Scott Coker has had some things with Bellator and Ryzen. Ryzen is not as prominent as some of the other organizations, but they've got good fighters, and they've actually co-promoted together. Nobody else has, and UFC says they'll never do it. The funny thing is, and I'll get back on track, some people point out one fight where they think the UFC co-promoted, but they didn't. It was actually kind of an interesting story. Pride Fighting Championship was around from like 1997 to 2006 when UFC bought them out. They were such an exciting event. If you guys want to see exciting, the show and the announcer, well, it was just so amazing.
They had the best fighters too.
Oh,
I mean, Vanderlei Silva in his heyday, Quentin Rampage Jackson,
Fedor, the Nogueira brothers, Dan
Mirko
Henderson.
Krokop.
Yeah, Alistair Overeem in his day. And
yes.
so, and so what happened was UFC hadn't really got the momentum going yet. They were still a couple years away, I think in 2004 or 3 from getting that momentum going. And Dana White started talking to the guys at Pride and said, I think our guy Chuck Liddell can beat any of your guys at that weight class. And they said, well, we're just kind of mixing it up and having some different tournaments, and what do you think about that? And then Dana said, yeah, okay, that's fine. Put me on the mic and identify Chuck as representing the UFC. And it was interesting because it kind of put Pride in a weird position, because if Chuck had run the tables on them, they would have looked pretty bad. But they had confidence in their fighters, and they're like, just do it, man. Do it, big man. Come on down. And in the first round of the light heavyweight tournament, I think is what that was called, Chuck did beat Alistair Overeem in an exciting fight. And Dana was on the microphone with Bas Rutten, and I think if it wasn't Stephen Quadros, it was either Frank Trigger, Mauro Ranallo. Might have been Mauro. But this event had nothing to do financially with the UFC. This was a Pride event. I doubt Dana or the Fertitta brothers was let into any profit sharing. Maybe they were. Maybe there was. I mean, they obviously Chuck had to get paid. But so that first fight, then I think it was a month or two later. It was not the same night. I'm pretty darn sure it was. Although sometimes,
yeah, I'm pretty sure it wasn't the same night.
Right. So I think a month or two later, right, he went up against Quentin Rampage Jackson, and it was a really good fight. But Rampage ended up taking him down and stopping him. Just Rampage was at his best, and that was that. And but that was a one-off, and nowhere on the broadcast on TV did it show the words UFC, except for, I think, under Chuck Liddell, it might have said UFC lightweight champion. But this was not a co-promotion. UFC has never co-promoted. And I'm not saying that with Pride. I wish they would, but they say they never will, and they actually never have. And that was an example of not having UFC co-promote. But where do I think? What I feel is that I would love to see that. I don't know if it's on the UFC to create that, but I know with the UFC being the big dog out there, if Dana and the guys reached out to Chatri and Scott Coker and Sugar Ray Sefo and said, listen, big surprise, but we're down now for having our guys fighting your guys. Everyone would love to see that. I mean, the one thing that the UFC would probably say is it would benefit those guys. It would bring so much attention and light to these smaller organizations that UFC would be like, why would we do this? And I think probably the other organizations might even say, look, UFC, you can keep 3/4 of the profit. We'll just take a quarter of the profit. Even their UFC would probably say, why would we give you that? That's still more money than your organization will have ever made on an event. UFC might say, we'll give you 5% or something. And so they might have to work that out, but I would love to see that. I don't know if we ever will. Other than that, the weight cutting thing, I think that one championship may have that Right. I'm not 100% knowledgeable about their results, but they've got it's a height, an amount of weight that you're allowed to put on.
The
Uh,
hydration tests too that
right.
are crucial. Yeah.
Yeah. And so a lot of guys in one are fighting 10 pounds heavier than they used to when they fought in
Right.
other organizations. And so, from what I gather, a lot of guys are fighting fully hydrated or at least close and really at their healthiest in one championship. Nevertheless, in the UFC, Bellator, and PFL, even though this weight cutting is tough, and once in a while you'll see a situation where a fighter can barely stand on the scale or even falls off. It's rare. They seem to have it down to a science. It's not good for you. It's not good for your kidneys. And the process of staying hydrated is ideal for life for human beings. And to be dehydrating, even if it's only 2-3 times a year, 4 times a year, tough on the body. So that's something maybe I wish that UFC could adopt, but it seems like they're doing okay without it. Nevertheless, it's still a little bit dangerous. The rules, I think UFC has are good. I think that no one really is pushing to bring back headbutts. Some fighters are. Some fighters are saying if you did, it would be more of a realistic fight. But I think that'd be too real. And not only that, it doesn't take a lot of skill or technique. You or me, well, probably not me at my age, but if you jumped in there, right, and they allowed headbutt.
No, my days of doing that are over.
I hear you. Not as long over as mine, but so I think no one's asking for that. But the knees on the ground or the soccer kicks or the stomps, but they do look very violent, and I think they might turn off a few people. Like I had a girlfriend that really liked the UFC, and then I showed her the old stuff, and she was like, "What the hell?" She's like, "That can't be legal," and I'm like, "It was then." And she was like, "Well, what kind?" Yeah, she was like, "What kind of fighting is that then? You might as well just take your shoe off and hit someone in the face with it, and you jump up in the air and land on someone's nuts or something like that, And,
Right.
And
Yeah,
so I mean, yeah. So
it's definitely tough. It's definitely tough for someone to be watching it that is new to it. My girlfriend recently, I took her out to watch the last pay-per-view event, and she said it's weird how it's just so free flowing. Like at one point they're striking, then they're wrestling. She said, I didn't know it was so quick. I thought maybe to your point earlier, one round they boxed, then another round they grappled. I was like, no, this is mixed martial arts. You see everything, every facet of combat within one contest, if you will. 15 minutes, 3 5-minute rounds, or 5 25-minute rounds, at least in the UFC. I really liked the examples you gave as to what is missing from the sport. One of the issues that I have talked about a lot, and I'm not, trying to step on anybody's toes here, but over the time of the growth of the sport, that it's just undeniable, the growth that the sport has had, even in the last 5 years, the last 6 years, 7 8 years, let alone the last 25, that for the most part the UFC fighter pay, or MMA fighter pay rather, has not changed really at all. And in some ways it's actually been manipulated to a point where these guys and gals can't really monetize their names as a brand. Can't go out to sponsorships, at least in the UFC, and say, hey, I'm bringing in Muscle Farm. I'm bringing in, at one point, we'll throw it out there, John Fitch came out with a condomdepot.com on his trunks. Things like that. I understand, the sport wants to be a little bit more cleaned up, but the fact that the fighters can't really get their own sponsorships and can't really go out and seek external paychecks outside of the UFC, where Bellator does allow fighters to do that. What do you think of that, as far as the a facet in this sport?
Yeah, and I was hoping you would mention that. It is a big problem. It is a big problem. Up until about 10 years ago, when the Reebok deal came, fighters early on, or in their or maybe the middle level of fighters that were like not top 10 yet, but were getting close. were making a lot more money. Now, the guys that are at the very top now are probably making more money than ever, but only them. Yeah, it's a problem. What happened was, used to be, depending on how popular a fighter you were, or how many wins, or how much of a buzzer was around you, you could earn anywhere from like 10, 20 grand to six figures from a sponsor, and you and your cornermen would wear the shirt that showed their company in big letters on the front and on the back and on your shorts. And then, the banner that the guys put over the top of the cage on their side, where their corner, it would be there too in big letters, right? And so it would be tremendous publicity for the company. Now, what was crazy was that the company would actually have to pay out 100 grand, I heard, to the UFC prior to any payout to the fighter. So UFC was taking a big bite of that even then. So which was unfortunate for the fighters, but nevertheless, the UFC was making great money too. Everyone was happy. And then when the UFC made the Reebok deal, it's essentially like they said, okay, let me do this. I'm going to go to one sponsor. We'll take 85% of the money, and then we'll drop the 15% crumbs onto the fighters. And very unfortunate, very unfair, stopping the fighters from getting their sponsors. The only fighters that seem to be happy with that are fighters that had already had 8, 10, 15, 20 fights, because the structure was set up so that it was like $1,000 or $1,500 guarantee sponsorship per fight that you've had. So a fighter that had 10 fights, let's say it was maybe 3,000, would get 30,000 added to their paycheck. However, prior to that, with regular sponsorship, he might have been taking in 100,000, but now he's getting 30. But worse for the guys who had only had one fight or 3 fights, where instead of getting 30, 40 grand, they're getting 3 or 6 grand. And
even
then the fight.
Right.
Yeah.
And not to interrupt you, even Patty Pimblett, who is somebody that is a rising star in the sport that generates a ton of eyeballs, because he has not had 10, 15 fights or 20 fights in the UFC like a Donald Cerrone, he's not making the money that he should be making. And
right.
I love how you broke that down for everybody.
Thank you. Now, Patty has a sponsor in Barstool Sports. The interesting thing is that, what's his name? Dave. I forget Dave's last name, but he's a really
Portnoy.
good Dave Portnoy. Yeah.
Yep.
I believe in that guy. I think he's a really good guy with good intentions. What he was able to do, since he has deep pockets, is to put Patty Pimblett and then the British girl, Molly McCann, a few other people under, like, I don't know what it exactly is, but it sounds like it's either like a yearly payout or a monthly payout, even though they can't wear his gear on a UFC on a UFC broadcast. Most companies are just not going to do that, because the reality is the whole thing would be, I'm going to bleed out all this money, but millions of people watching are going to see the name of my company, and they're going to see their favorite fighter looking like he believes in my company because he's wearing the gear. And if you can't do that, so it's kind of, so Patty, I don't know what money he's making, but with Dave Portnoy, it's definitely helped him make ends meet, even though he can't wear the gear. But the other fighters don't have a Dave Portnoy, and a lot of them are not doing well. They got to pay more money. I mean, it's not just UFC. I believe the pay scale for the lower echelon fighters just coming up, and the fighters that kind of win one, lose one, is not that good anywhere. The only difference that the other organizations can say is, we may be paying people like the UFC, but UFC has 100 times the budget that we have, and 100 times the money, and that is a problem. I not to drag this on, but I feel like they're not doing the right thing. And I know that what Dana's trying to say is this, like, let me give you an example. If people at the cash register of the supermarket are making $20 an hour now, could the owner of these huge supermarkets make it 25? Yes. Could they make it 30? Yes. Could they make it 50? Yes. But if they took the cashiers from $20 an hour to $50 an hour, they it would definitely be cutting into their profit. Could they still make it? Yes, but it would be cutting substantially into their profit. But could they make it $30 or $35 an hour? Yes. So I know Dana White's trying to say, look, we're paying out 15% of our profits to fighters, and that allows us to keep the show rolling. I get that. I get you probably couldn't make it 70% fighters and 30% UFC, but I think you could make it a lot more than 85-15. I think you could make it actually closer to 50-50. And the only difference is that the UFC wouldn't be making millions of dollars hand over fist, but they'd still be doing well, and the fighters could be doing really well also. I know that you could go too far the other way. And I think that's what the UFC is trying to say. But I think if you could go all the way here and screw yourself up by overpaying your fighters, it doesn't have to be way over here.
Right.
Bring it maybe over here.
And over the years, prominent fighters, George St. Pierre, TJ Dillashaw, Donald Cerrone, they tried to put together a fighters union. It was on the scene, and then it wasn't. That was, for the lack of a better term, that was somewhat a disaster in terms of how that came about, and then it was just gone. And that was just kind of sniffed out relatively quickly, unfortunately. And, there's a lot of guys that have become prominent names. UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou, who came from a really rough. I mean, his story is a movie. His life is a movie. If you've never heard it, it's definitely one that MMA fans should read about. And now he's the UFC heavyweight champion. He's the top dog. He's the baddest man on the planet, like Mike Tyson was back in the day. But he's the baddest man of the planet in the UFC. And he's talking about fighter pay, that my title fights aren't making me enough money, and I need to get this and that. So I do believe, to your point, that the top guys, McGregor obviously is the cash cow, always will be the cash cow, as far as the money that he has brought in for the sport and the records, pay-per-view, and all that stuff. And Adesanya makes money, and a lot of the top fighters, the champions, make money. Top contenders make decent money, but if you are an aspiring mixed martial arts fighter, that is a rough path to choose outside of the fights, just in terms of what you're going to go through in terms of finding sponsorships, finding your way in terms of how to make this dream a monetary success. And I think that, to your point, a lot of the points that you made, 85-15, 85% goes to the UFC, 15 goes to the fighters. I'd like to see that, 60-40. At the very worst, 60-40. So I definitely wanted to bring that up to you.
Let me, if I could, of coattail on your statement, because I don't want to seem like we're saying that anything I'm saying is contradictory to what you're saying.
Right.
On the low and middle level, the fighters are just terribly underpaid. They're not doing well at all, and it's a disaster. However, on the higher end, I don't want people to think I'm saying that Francis Ngannou should shut up, or Cowboy when he was on his way, or John Jones. They shouldn't shut up, but this is what the problem is there. Are these guys getting money that most of us will never see in our life? Yes, $1 million per, if you include pay-per-view points and whatever, maybe $2 million, some of them $500,000, some of them maybe as much as $3 million when all is said and done. Some of these guys are, but what they're looking at is their counterparts in boxing are getting 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 million. And that's a separate issue. And in reality, they are right about that. Now, it's not the same. And then one situation, the fighters in the middle level or the lower level are having to have a second job. Like a lot of these fighters, you've seen them, their name. They have fan clubs. They have beautiful girls throwing themselves at them, but yet they're working at McDonald's as well as the UFC, or maybe not McDonald's, but they're driving Uber and delivering food and doing whatever. And that's really a shame. That's a huge problem. Not as much of a shame or a huge problem is on the top end, though, although I still consider it a problem. And that's what it is the best guys are saying, why do I need to accept like 1/10 the payment of what my counterparts in boxing are getting? And in reality, the only response really by kind of the UFC or the other organizations would be that it's different. That they're used to that pay structure. They're used to preparing to keep themselves going and be happy with an even cut with the fighters. We're not used to that model. We'd have to do a whole bunch of changes and restructure everything. And I think UFC is saying if forced to pay the big guys 30, 40, 50 million dollars, that it's possible that if they have a bad event, right? If they have a bad event that for some reason people don't buy the pay-per-view, then they could take a really big hit. Whereas boxing has accepted that. Boxing has accepted that this is just what it is. We've got to split with the big name fighters 50-50. We hope that our pay-per-view event isn't a bust, but some of them will be.
Right.
We're okay. We hate to say that instead of making 20 million on this event, we lost 10 million. But when we've got, several $100 million in our bank account, it'll be what it'll be. We can cry as we're eating our, $1,000 steak, wearing our $5,000 suit, with two ring card girls, on the side. And I think the UFC could do that. They could do that. But they're basically kind of saying that, we don't want to do it on the low end, and we don't want to do it on the high end. And the problem that they're having is that on the high end, their fighters are saying, you know what, then I may just bail on this. Then you're not going to take care of me. I may just bail on this, and and that's what's going on. And then Francis, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. But I think if more fighters like Francis and John Jones and other people say that.
Exactly. That's
maybe it will. Too. Right. Maybe it will.
Maybe it'll fix itself. Yeah.
Right. At some point,
it's going to take those names to say what they're saying to get anything fixed.
Right. The only tough thing is that if UFC is not going to pay 10, 20, 30 million, PFL, Bellator, and one really can't.
Won't. Right.
Won't. Kind of won't. Kind of can't. And so they'll have to get someone willing to pay them a lot of money in boxing. Now, as a heavyweight, Francis can get that. They could make a fight with Tyson Fury and Francis or some of the other guys, but some of the smaller fighters are not quite as well known, or maybe don't have that striking ability as Francis, might not be able to get that. So it'd be kind of scary for them to kind of grandstand like that. Like Francis is in the best position to do it. Francis knows that if UFC finally throws their arms up and said, you know what, your contract's over, just GTFO, do whatever. We don't care about you. Then it's good. You'll see a contract signed within a month or two for millions. But anyone other than Francis, they can't have that much confidence. Maybe they'll be looking to fight. They'll be looking to fight Jake Paul or Logan or something. But there's only so many fights those guys can take, and so
Yes, that's a fact. Anyone that knows anything in combat sports, I think, recognizes what's going on with the Paul brothers, picking and choosing, and I get it. I respect it to an extent, and we'll say this, Jake Paul probably provided Anderson Silva with one of his best paydays of his entire career, and that is the end all be all. Wheels go round and round, circle the wagons. Point is that it shouldn't come to a 47 or 46-year-old Anderson Silva fighting a YouTuber turned boxer for him to make a multi-million-dollar payday. It's to be honest, it's sad. It bothers me as somebody that really appreciates the sport and the athletes that compete in it, and I hope that it changes. And I really liked your assessment of that. So I mentioned Francis Ngannou. To kind of go into my next talking point, I want to give you a little bit of a rapid fire here. Does Francis Ngannou versus John Jones happen in 2023? Do you think that there is a realistic shot based on both guys asking for more money, based on both guys knowing that this fight is being buzzed about by MMA fans, that this could potentially happen? It's the biggest fight I think that the UFC could put on, one that would generate, potentially a couple million pay-per-view buys, especially in the summertime, International Fight Week, 4th of July weekend. What do you think, Colin? Do you think that I'm onto something, or do you think that, maybe I'm just living in a dream world?
No, you're definitely onto something. And I was looking to the side because before I speak, I want to make sure I'm exactly on target with how old they both are, because that matters. Okay, so
Yes.
John Jones is 35 years old and will be 36 in July. Francis Ngannou, I think, is slightly younger. Let's see. Let's go to this really quick here. Sorry to be looking away here, but okay. Francis Ngannou
Francis
is
is 36 in his own right.
yeah,
Yep.
he is. So um, they can't wait around that much longer. Now, interestingly enough, they're right about the same age, so or 10 months older. Francis is. Power is the last thing to go. Reflexes go quicker than your power. That's why George Foreman regained the heavyweight championship at age 45, I think it was, and you know, but speed and reflexes can go. So perhaps Francis might be a little bit of an advantage, because in a fight with him, the speed and reflexes with Jones are going to be really important for Jones. I think it will happen. I mean, here's the interesting thing: the UFC contracts are very, very much in their favor. I know they have a class action suit against them. Speaking as we did with John Fitch and I think Kung Lee and Nate Corey and several people. I'm hoping and I'm thinking maybe they've gotten a little bit better since they did. The suit was filed against them years ago, but a lot of the contracts I think favor the UFC, basically saying we can cut you anytime from your contract, but if you win, you owe us another fight. Every time you win, you owe us another fight, or at least one. So I don't know. So let me just speculate. I imagine that at some point, if Francis won't come through with a fight for the UFC, maybe at some point they're just going to say, you know, the hell with it. But I think they realize that he's hoping for that, and then they might not. I mean, the only thing I can think of is if he says, you know, like when Conor fought Floyd Mayweather in boxing, the UFC took a chunk of that.
They took a chunk for sure.
Right, and that's the only way Conor was allowed to fight, because he was a UFC fighter.
To your point earlier, that's like the only co-promote they've ever done, truthfully.
Right, and right, exactly. And so, and I think Conor was on really good terms then, and I think right away, him and Dana, like he always thought of Dana as uncle. I don't know if some of that was for show. Maybe really they both thought each other were big douchebags, but it looked like they were buddies. His Uncle Dana and Conor was the Irish golden boy, and you know
they seemed pretty tight. They seemed pretty tight.
Right, and,
they did.
Right, and so I think going into the Floyd fight, it sounds like Conor went right to Dana and the UFC, and immediately they talked about it. Now in this case, Francis wasn't that tight with them, and Francis didn't go right to Dana and say, "Listen, maybe we could both make money on a big boxing event." He just kind of like said, "I don't want to be underpaid," which is his right. And but it wasn't all lovey-dovey. Now, could that be repaired if Francis could bring a proposal that shows that the Tyson Fury promotion, whichever guy is his promoter, has like $40 million for Francis, and then that Francis would be willing to give the UFC 15 or 20? Could he do that? He could. I don't know why the UFC would say no. They might, but for some reason, I get a feeling that's not going to happen. If that doesn't happen, then I really don't know. I mean, I think that Francis seems like a nice guy and a reasonable guy. If the UFC would like to say to Francis, look, with pay-per-view points, you'll end up between 4 to 6 million or 5 to 7 million for the John Jones fight, we promise. And if Francis is saying, if it was boxing, it'd be 35, 40 million. And then UFC saying, for sure, you're not getting that. Maybe somehow they can come to a compromise in the middle. Maybe somehow, like, you know, I got to figure there's a number that will make Francis happy. It probably won't be 8 million, 9 million. It'll probably be, you know, an 8-figure paycheck. It'll have to be 10 million or over, I think, and maybe even closer to 15 or 20. But then if he gets that, John's not going to fight him for 1 million. Right?
And that's my point. That's my point, Colin.
Yeah.
To your point, Francis Ngannou has every right to kind of name his price, so to speak, or maybe name his price, and then the UFC says, "Well, this is the price," and then he says, "We're going to compromise." But I know John Jones as one of the greatest to ever do it. He's probably one of the most talented fighters that I have ever seen, and probably that you have ever seen as well, Colin.
Yeah.
But it's very hard for me to come up with a laundry list of reasons as to why John Jones should be able to pound the table and say, I deserve this, I deserve that, when John Jones has been so inactive, mostly due to things that happened outside the octagon that kind of damaged his own reputation. So that's a completely different, negotiation between Jones and the UFC, I feel, than Ngannou and the UFC, and that might be why this fight doesn't happen in terms of putting these two names together. I know Francis Ngannou's best opportunity, though, in MMA to get a big payday is to fight a John Jones, and John Jones' biggest opportunity to get a payday, get back some relevancy, is to fight a Francis Ngannou. What do you think in terms of just the difference in negotiation for both guys, especially for Jones?
Glad you asked. So with John Jones, I think Dana and the team over at UFC can say, listen, man, you have no track record in heavyweight. And you're talking about going up against the most powerful, brutal striker heavyweight in the history of our sport, probably. And we have no proof that you won't get knocked out in the first 10 seconds. And I think they could say, and if that happened, people will be really pissed. People will be upset. It'll look bad. It'll be bad for our brand, and the fans will be booing. And you can laugh because you squeezed us out of millions of dollars. We're not gonna. Why should we take that risk? Why should we even consider taking that risk? Then Jones can be like, come on, no, you guys know me. I'm a smarter guy. If I have to wrestle, I will, this and that, whatever. Still, there's no proof. So I think that's something that Jones has to be aware of. And I don't think Jones would ask for parity in pay with Francis. But I think, let's just say Francis negotiates for $15 million. I think Jones wouldn't do it then for one. He wouldn't do it for 2, 3, 4. Maybe he'd do it for 5. I think he'd say, I've proven myself a lot more, albeit not in the heavyweight class, than Francis. I'm the one that really is undefeated, even though there's that one disqualification loss on my record. Why would I take an embarrassingly lower amount? But I have a feeling maybe close to 10 or 5, 6, 7, but that does mean they'll be having to come out of pocket with a lot of money. The one thing the UFC is doing now is after paying $4.2 billion for the organization, I think 6 years ago, I think it was, they're in recovery mode. I don't know how much they've made since then, but it's not $4.2 billion. And I think they probably had a target that something like within 8 years or 10 years or 6 years, that they better make that money back and be in the green and start making profit. So I think that they're not wanting to do anything but have 7-figure or 8-figure profit events. And if they do 15 million Francis, 5 million John Jones, very likely it'll be a break-even event at best, if not a loss. I mean,
it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah,
it's a tough one.
Maybe, the funny thing is they're going to probably add, the more reasonable that Francis is, the more reasonable John can be, right?
Right.
So I think if Francis accepts 7, then John probably will accept 3 or 4. Right. But if Francis demands 15, John's not going to accept 3 or 4. It really should happen. But it's not like they're 28 years old or even 32.
It's their last chance to really get a big payday, I feel.
Yeah, because if this crap continues, if somehow this crap continued for, let's say, 2 more years, it's possible both men may run out of money. Right. I mean, and literally be confronted with finding a day job somewhere.
Right.
And they'll be 38 years old.
And in the case
So,
of John Jones, I mean, he hasn't fought since 2020, and
right.
we're in 2023, and Francis has rattled off a lot of nice knockouts. I'm sure he, could venture into doing a lot of other stuff, maybe movies. He was in a Fast and Furious
Yeah.
movie. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of things he could do. He's a very smart guy. John Jones is a smart guy too. He's made some mistakes, but who hasn't? I really feel it's a tough one. It's much easier the way I pitched it. International Fight Week, heavyweight championship, baddest dude on the planet, and Ngannou Jones, one of the most talented fighters ever. It's a no-brainer when you talk about it like that. But when you get into the nitty-gritty of the negotiation and where both of these guys are at in their respective careers, it's a tough one to put together.
It is. I just had one thought.
Sure.
Suppose the UFC, and I may actually be hitting on something here. Suppose the UFC says, "Look, we're not gonna get into promising 8-figure payoffs anytime soon. But what if we gave Francis $7 million cash, John $4 million, but we give a historically large piece of the pay-per-view both of you?"
That's probably what would make it happen. That's probably the only way that would make it happen.
Right.
To be honest.
I don't see why they couldn't do that. Now, Francis and John are both intelligent men, and I think what Francis might say is, "But why do you have to make me speculate like that? Why do you have to make me wait on pins and needles? And how do I know that your lawyers won't fabricate the overall pay-per-view buys and send me a printout that shows that I'm only making $2 million on my pay-per-view points when I could have made that?" But then they'd have to say, "Dude, we'll go to the office or wherever and you'll see it." I think Francis still might say, "I'd rather not be on pins and needles to see if I'm making 8, 10, 20 million when boxing doesn't make their fighters be on pins and needles." But then again, the UFC might say, "How many people do you think won't buy that pay-per-view? I mean, we'll put huge fights on the undercard."
I know that would be an amazing pay-per-view if that was at the top of it. One thing we do know about Dana White is that he is all about making a great card for the fight.
Yeah, they don't want to have an unsuccessful pay-per-view.
Right. So if John Jones and Francis don't fight, do you think John Jones ever fights again, Colin? Do you think he will? I know he's working out and doing it. I follow him. Obviously, I'm a big fan of John Jones, and I want to see him back. Don't let that get twisted. I want to see John Jones back. He's working out at heavyweight with Henry Cejudo, training him and all that stuff. But if this fight doesn't happen, what does he train for? What does he come back to? It's tough.
Yeah, so John Jones is not going to beat anyone in boxing. He might not even really be able to beat Jake Paul in boxing. In fact, I have a feeling he wouldn't. He's never been a big, powerful puncher, but then he was always fighting skinny at light heavyweight, and now he's a thick heavyweight. So look at his brothers, and I know that's not the whole story because his brothers are different than him, even though they're 100% blood brothers. They're both huge men in the NFL. I think one of them is always over 300 pounds, and the other one's not far. So I gotta believe John has been kind of staying artificially slim to have the advantages he's had by being so tall and athletic and strong at light heavyweight. If there was no evidence of him putting the weight on, then it could make people question how much he wants to be a heavyweight. But there's evidence. He's got pictures and video all over the place. Not all over the place, but in several places. You can see the man's thick. The man's probably 240, 250, 260. I know people that have trained with him for years, other people that have trained with him recently, other people that know him. They all say he's big now. He can be big. He was always pretty big. He just had to make a big weight cut to make 205. So that stated, I don't think he would have put in this effort to put on all that muscle and put all that tax on his joints, strain on his joints from all this weightlifting over the last few years to then not choose to compete in MMA at heavyweight, and he's not going to be invited to compete in boxing anywhere. So I think he will fight. I think he will fight. And the good thing is that if it's not Francis, he will be the higher paid fighter. And I think if he's fighting someone that he doesn't take the risk of having his head knocked off his body like Francis, I think he wouldn't mind taking 2-3 million. I think he would deal with the Cyril Gane for 2-3 million. I think he'd deal with the Russian Sergei Pavlovich. Who else is in there?
Curtis Blades.
Curtis Blades, yes, right. Yes. I think he would have no problem. And not to say he would beat all those guys or any of them, but I think he would realize they don't have as big enough names to demand all this. I think he would say, just, it's got to be 7 figures, but I'll take 2 million, 3 million, or 2 million plus pay-per-view. I think he'll do it. So I think we will see him. But if Francis can't get the Jones fight, I don't think they're going to be offering him a lot of money for anybody else. And, so if I was forced, I would say a better chance we'll see Jones than Francis, especially when Francis got the boxing. I mean, it's not on the table, but you just know that it would be, right? So that's what I think it is. We got this huge chunk over here and this huge white gypsy king from England, from the travelers and the gypsies.
Isn't he something? Isn't he something? Oh, my. That guy, man, Tyson Fury, sidebar, I know we're talking MMA here, but Tyson Fury, I think he saved heavyweight boxing. I really do. I think he saved it for the best in every which way. I have nothing but great things to say about the guy. I absolutely think the world of him.
He's a cool dude. Apparently he's extremely generous with his money. He's extremely humble. He doesn't take himself seriously. He's not a big ego guy. And I guess really his people are travelers or gypsies. And I think there's 2 classifications of them. And he came from the one that's much more honorable.
Right.
But apparently, that's how they would dispute. You would fight. You would physically get into a fist fight to hammer out the dispute so you could put it past you.
With a name like Tyson Fury, you gotta be tough. You gotta be a fighter, right?
Right, and he
checks off all the boxes. Yes, yeah.
Yep,
it's great.
It's
awesome.
I would love to see him and Francis. I would love to see that. And so, but it would be a loss for MMA. But fortunately, MMA fans have eyes and have $80 or whatever, and we can buy the Fury Ngannou. I think we just want to see Francis. Everyone's getting Predator withdrawal. Like, come on, Francis, get in there. Come on.
I need to see Francis against anyone. I'd want to see it.
As long as it wasn't you and me.
No, not against me. Yeah, no one would want to see that pay-per-view. That's for sure.
Me either. Walking with a cane here.
So I want to get your last question. I looked up at the time. We're in an hour and 20 minutes. I thought I'd take 45 minutes of your time, but I'm having a lot of fun with
crazy. It's because I'm talking like crazy. But yeah,
I love it. I love it.
I know you don't want to go all night either, but whatever you got, you need me. But go ahead.
Yeah. So I do have to ask you. This is the question that I think every hardcore casual fan, whatever label on a fan you want to. There's a lot of labels out there for fans these days in MMA. There's casuals, there's hardcore, there's the beginning fans, UFC 1, 2, 3.
Purists.
This sport now is a purist. Yeah, this sport is now at its a different level to where there is different categories now for fans, and everyone wants to know what's going on with Conor McGregor and Conor McGregor's return. What's our take? I'll ask for your take on his potential comeback. I know, obviously, he suffered a devastating injury, and the last time we saw him inside the octagon against Dustin Poirier, he had to have leg surgery, basically broke the bone right in half, just like Anderson Silva, just like Chris Weidman. And we're seeing a new Conor McGregor. Social media, he's got a massive following, 50-some million Instagram followers, and we're seeing this guy completely transform his body. There's been a lot of speculation as to how and why that's happened. I won't really go down that road, but what I will say is, what do you think of where Conor McGregor is at in his career right now? He's filming Roadhouse with Jake Gyllenhaal. He's doing some boxing training, it looks like, at the Crumlin Boxing Gym where he trained as a kid. What are your thoughts on when we could see Conor McGregor again, and who would you want to see him fight in his MMA comeback?
Excellent questions, and I just pulled him up so I can 100% be on point with details of what I'm talking about. Not that I don't know, but knowing every single fight and when and exactly,
Sure.
you can't always do that. So, all right, so he's been a pro fighter coming up on 15 years, and he's 34 years old now. So 34 isn't young, but a lot of guys didn't start at 19 either in MMA. So that's a lot of years of toll on your body. Now, agreed, in the last 5 years, not many fights, but before that, there were a lot of fights. Yeah, he looks like he's bulked up like crazy. Usually in your late 20s, early 30s, you get a little bit of that bone density, extra thickness. You know, like you go to bed and you're like 165 and you wake up and you're 180 and you didn't really have any big meals, but it's just you're 29 or 30 or 31. At, at 34, I guess there's another little move, but it shouldn't be this big. He obviously wanted to get bigger. He was fighting super skinny early on. He's 5'9" and a muscular, strong guy. You probably know, and a lot of people know, I know from lifting weights for many years, is you start getting a good cumulative benefit as years go by. If you notice, other than guys doing steroids or guys with amazing gains, you don't tend to see guys in their mid-20s really broad, really V-shaped, and really thick, dense muscles. But you do tend to see guys at 35 and especially even 40 and over because of the cumulative effect of decades of lifting weights and getting big and thick. So I think some of that's happening, and because of all that muscle, he probably would be a guy, even when he's lean, that would maybe walk around at like 180, 185, maybe even at 5'9", maybe even 190. But it looks now in these pictures like he's 200 something. It's crazy. I mean, with all the money he has, it's almost like you see these guys going out with all kinds of different girls. They got tall, they got short, they got busty, they got slim, they got this race girl, that race. These guys that have all this money are trying, they want to try all kinds of stuff. They get the Rolls Royce, they don't like it and trade it back in, and they get a Bugatti, and then they don't like that. I get a feeling almost he was like, you know what? I feel like eating a ton of food, whatever I want, and just lifting heavy weights and looking like this Irish Viking brute, and just to see how it would feel, right? Like he probably feels really strong. He can probably, help do a lot more lifting of heavy stuff around his house than he would have when he was 150, 60 pounds. But at 5'9", what kind of guy is going to compete in combat sports weighing 220 or 230 or 240? I know Mike Tyson was actually slightly taller and did compete at 220 and more. But Mike Tyson, when he was 14, 15 years old, was like 180 pounds of muscle. If you look at those photographs, he looks like a man among boys. It's funny. I saw a show where he was looking at old pictures as they were broadcasting, and he looked at that and he said, "Look at me." He said, "I'm like Baby Joe Young or whatever." He said he sees all these skinny kids, and he's like 5'9", 180, and he's like, "Look at that."
He looked like he was their dad.
Right. And he laughed, and he's like, "How the hell? Why am I so big? What?" But that's what you call a really big frame, not a tall man, but a very large frame, like
wide frame, wide back. Yeah,
right. Connor doesn't have that, so I don't see him fighting anyone weighing 200 anything. So he'd have to lose his weight back, but I'm sure he could. So let's look chronologically really quick here. Conor McGregor's last few years, he fought Floyd, I think it was 5 years ago, about.
Yep.
And since then, he lost to Khabib Nurmagomedov, and there's no shame in that, but Khabib is a legend. He's a legend. He came back and beat Cowboy Cerrone. I was at that fight. There was nothing to it. Cowboy was already, unfortunately, shop worn, and his reflexes weren't there, and Conor took advantage of that really quick by attacking him. And then 2 losses against Dustin Poirier. Dustin's a badass. Dustin's a beast. Dustin was taking it seriously. Dustin was fighting for food and his family's livelihood, whereas Conor already had $50 million in the bank and more from. So he's 1-3 in his last 4 fights. 34 years old. If he's going to make a move and fight again, it's going to be in the next year and a half or two. Although you can never know with a guy like that. I mean, he's an unusual guy. He's very confident. He may be saying, you know what, I don't care. I'm just going to wait until the opportunity and the money is good and the interest is there. And he may figure if it's when I'm 37 or when I'm 39, fine. I personally would think his team wouldn't want him to try that. Not everyone's done when they're 37, 39, or 40 years old, but their reflexes will definitely be slower. Their recovery ability will definitely be slower. But maybe if you're as confident a guy as Connor, maybe that's even more fun for you. Maybe he's going to want to wait till he's 40 and just say, yeah, everyone told me when I was 34, I better do something quick because blah, 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 I'm too old. So I purposely waited till I'm 40 to give you guys the middle finger and say, now I'm coming back and I'm not scared. Shove it, go cry yourself to sleep while I collect a big paycheck and beat someone's ass at 40. I wouldn't put it past Connor. Wouldn't be the smartest thing, but I don't know. I think he'll be back before then, though. I do. But it would have to be the money and the interest would have to be there. And would it be MMA or boxing? Boxing and the training for boxing is decidedly easier than the training for MMA.
Right.
And training for boxing isn't easy. But MMA is so much harder on your body. So his potential comeback, I think we'll see it. I think it'll be a one-off, though. I don't think he has his eyes on any boxing title or on any MMA title. The only thing I could think of is that if some champion wins that he finds to be especially vulnerable, and that would be interesting if somehow someone won a light heavyweight title or something in boxing on a huge upset. Or same thing in MMA, someone wins welterweight or middleweight title, and Connor feels I can beat that guy. We might see him jump in because he sees the weakness, and it would be sick if he came back and did win a title.
It would be a massive comeback. It'd probably be one of the greatest comebacks in MMA history.
It would be up, yeah.
It would be up there, especially with the injury that he suffered. I'm always curious with Connor, his motivation. You touched on the money, not just the money he made from fighting, Colin, but the money that he's made from Proper 12.
Yes.
What he did with that money that he made from it, invested it, was very smart. He's a very smart guy. A lot of people, look at his personality and say, "Oh, this guy's wild." That's the illusion. I honestly see Conor McGregor as somebody that most people don't see him as. Much to your point about how most fighters that achieve success at that high of a level, they're whining and dining every woman that they can possibly get the attention of. And it's not that hard for them to get the attention and get not just women, but just everything is in excess. This guy has had the same coaches, the same family people around him, kept his family close, and he's kept the same woman around his entire, from when he was 15 till now. I respect that. I think that's something about him that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. He's got a great family. He's a father of, 3 or 4 kids now. I just think the motivation's a little bit different. Once you do have a couple kids, changes the I guess, to your point about Francis Ngannou, calling him the predator, it changes that killer instinct. It changes a fighter. I think any fighter that has kids that has talked about that has said that it changes you. So I wonder what his motivation is now as a father, as somebody that has made a lot of money. Really, he could ride off into the sunset and everyone would wave him goodbye and say thanks for everything you've done for the sport. But I think he is going to come back. I'm hoping he comes back. I would personally like to see him fight potentially Michael Chandler or maybe a Dustin Poirier rematch. I think there's some fights out there for him that people would tune in to see. It's just a matter of, does he want to do it? Does he want to do it? And that's the question.
And there's the old saying, it's hard to get up for training at 6 a.m. when you're sleeping on silk sheets.
Marvin Hagler, right? Yep. I believe so. I believe it was Marvin Hagler. Yeah.
About Sugar Ray Leonard. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. So wrapping it up here, we got a big fight card this weekend. I want your quick picks for UFC 283, Glover Teixeira versus Jamal Hill. You got, who else do you got? You got Gilbert Burns versus Neil Magny. And you cannot forget about part 4 between Davison Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno. This is a true rarity in combat sports. You've seen some amazing trilogies in the history of the UFC, MMA history. I've seen some amazing trilogies as well in boxing and MMA. Have you ever seen two guys go to war 3 times to where you need a fourth fight to settle the score once and for all? What do you think about this fight between Figgy and Moreno? We'll start off with that one.
So it's very unusual. I think this may be the only time that I have seen that, but you got to know why that is. 3 times is usually the rubber match when both guys have won once. However, this 4th time is the rubber match because the first fight was a draw.
Right.
So this is why we're seeing it. Not only that, it's the fight to make. I think the interim champ, or you know what? It's got so confusing with the back and forth and one of them being hurt. It's either that Moreno's the interim champ, which I think he is, and Figueiredo's out. Yeah. Yep. So it's the interim champ against the champ, and this is the rubber match, having the first match go to a draw. Man, I was there in person in the press section for their last fight, and I like Brandon so much. I've been a big Brandon Moreno fan for a while. Never was a big, he's amazing. What a great kid, amazing role model, first ever Mexican national UFC fighter. Never was the biggest fan of Figgy, but nothing against him. I just didn't know him. He wasn't as personable. I tend to cheer for these guys that are a regular guy or like the baby face assassin with this big smile on his face. You know what I mean? Figgy is just a stone cold killer, but he's a talented guy. I've talked to him in person through his interpreter. I'm on good terms with his management team, including the great Walid Ismail, and so excited about that. That fight could go either way. The younger fighter by far is Brandon Moreno, and let's pull that information up here. Davison Figueiredo is 35 years old at 125 pounds. That's not the best age to be. It's all about speed and reflexes there. Now, he's a clean living guy, a determined warrior of a guy, and he cuts weight. He's a big flyweight, and but at some point, age will catch up with you a little bit, and I feel like he may have slowed down a little bit already, although it wasn't enough to matter. Nevertheless, he's 35 years old, and the man he's facing, I know, is not even 30, 29 years old. Is Moreno. So Figgy needs this win more than Moreno because of his age. But I think Moreno is the future of that division. No one believes Henry Cejudo is going to ever get back down at 125, and I think he's never even entertained that. So, as the older guy here, normally what I might say is, well, let Figgy have this one, and then a year or 2 from now, maybe the 5th fight, Brandon beats him handily once he loses a step. But I like Brandon so much. He's such a good kid. I think he'll win this fight. I think this is where the youth comes in, and I think if he wins this fight and wins it somewhat convincingly because of Figgy having lost the step, which maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But if he did, that'll be it for Figgy, at least as far as for the contention. But he's not gonna go out without a fight, literally, and he's gonna fight down. It's gonna be war. He's gonna step right into the fire. And Brandon's got to change up his strategy from that last fight where he looked a little bit off with his putting his arms out there. So it's going to be an amazing fight. And then the other fights on UFC 283, just to make sure people know, there is a UFC Fight Night card tomorrow. So this is very nice. But this is a nice pay-per-view card. So you want me to comment on maybe the main card on that one? On 83? Or do you want to mention anything? I was telling you want to focus on 83.
I just have my focus on 83 just because of the 2 title fights.
Sure.
Obviously, the next UFC card is tomorrow night, as you mentioned, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. Of course, on ESPN. Is it on ESPN Plus or is it actually on TV tomorrow?
Well, it's always on Plus anyway. but
That's
it may be on ABC as well, or ESPN 1 or 2. I watch it on Plus. I'm a streaming guy.
I'm a streaming guy as well.
Yeah.
So,
as far as I know.
Sean Strickland versus Nasruddin Imanov, Imavov,
Yep.
and Danny Ige and Damon Jackson, Ketlin Vieira and Raquel Pennington. Yep. I love the women and their ability in the octagon in terms of they're always bringing it. Every female fight is just phenomenal, in my opinion.
They really are.
Umar Nurmagomedov, 15-0 against Ronnie Barcelos. That's going to be
Habib's cousin. That's going to be a sick fight. Umar is like a 7.5 to 1 favorite, but that's an overlay. Barcelos from Brazil is a beast. A lot of people are looking at the fact that I think he's like 8-17-3, and he's lost 2 out of his last 3. One was a majority decision against a top 20 fighter, and the other was he just looked flat, and it was the last second opponent. So both of those could very well have been victories, in which case he would be 19-1 instead of 17-3, and he'd be on like an 11-fight win streak. Wow. So even though that's not the case as it stands, he's got that kind of confidence in himself. He is older though, and so hopefully he hasn't lost a step in the last few months. And if he hasn't, that's going to be a good fight. But yeah, those are all going to be good fights there. Look forward to seeing those. Strickland took this fight on like 6 days' notice. It's at light heavyweight because they guessed Strickland to come off the bench, off the couch for this fight essentially, and so that's going to be interesting. The Dagestani, raised in France, Imavov is a tough guy. This will be a great fight.
Imavov is going to be a tough one. I think it's going to be a great main event. I really do.
Me too. Yeah. The odds are really close. But if you want me to, the women's fight's going to be great. If you want me to jump to 83, I'll jump to 183. Glover Teixeira, Jamal Hill. What a bizarre situation. I won't ramble on too much about this. But 4 months ago, the champ was Yuri Prochazka, sorry, one of two, from I think from Poland or the Eastern Bloc somewhere. Not Poland.
One of the most dynamic light heavyweights I've ever seen, and that's high praise, right?
Yes, he's an exciting guy. He beat Glover Teixeira, took his title about 8-9 months ago. It was an amazing fight. Could have gone either way, and he caught Glover, I think, in the 5th round to win that title. The rematch was supposed to be what we were seeing tomorrow, or originally maybe like a few weeks ago. And no, the rematch was what we were supposed to see several weeks ago.
Right, we were supposed to see that last month or so.
And what happened? Right, Yuri got hurt, and he had an injury so bad that the UFC felt that he was going to be out for probably a year, if not more. So they said, we got to do an interim. We can't let this be held up for a year. They made it they had the two guys in the undercard, Magomed Ankalaev, the Dagestani, against
Jan Blachowicz.
Right, and so they approached Glover for some reason, and they said, look, the guy that's got more traction that you haven't fought before, that people are talking about, is the young Dagestani, Ankalaev. Mm-hmm. And at 43 years old, he probably made the wise decision, which is not to fight that guy on like 4 days' notice.
Right.
And he said, no, but give me Glover, no, give me Jan, and it's done. And they're like, no, you're not going to fight Ankalaev, then get the hell out of here. And they went to Jan, and they said, you guys want to be the main event? And Ankalaev and Jan said, yeah. It was very weird. They just kind of like pretty much pushed Glover out when he
pushed the co-main event up to the main event and Glover right out the door.
Pushed Glover right out of it. And not so that these guys fight to a draw, even though most of us felt that Ankalaev won, but it was close.
I did. Right, it was close. Right. Yeah.
But you would figure when they fight for a draw, the rematch of that draw would be what we're seeing now, or a few. But instead, they said, "Oh, you guys didn't go for it. This is unimpressive. Neither of you will be fighting for the title."
Right.
And it's like, what the hell? So they say, but we'll bring Glover back, and we'll bring the young up-and-comer Jamal Hill for the title. And I bet Ankalaev and Jan are sitting here going, how does that work out?
And you know what? Yeah, not only that, but Jamal Hill was expected to fight Anthony Smith
Right.
And Anthony Smith got completely screwed over in this
Yeah,
whole
very just
situation.
very weird, very
Yeah.
very odd. But nevertheless, you have Glover Teixeira, former champion, 43 years old, 33-8 is his record, 41 total fights. He's going up against Jamal Hill, the 31-year-old who's got 12 fights. So you have a guy with 41 fights against a guy with 12 fights. But the guy with 12 fights is also right in his athletic prime, especially for a light heavyweight at 31. 43 isn't right in anyone's athletic prime. Glover, at his best, I think wins this fight, but that would be probably 4, 5, 6 years ago. At this age, the big question, and I've talked to several fighters about this, what do you think? And they pretty much all say if Glover lost a step in the last 6, 7 months since Yuri, when was that fight? If Glover lost a step since last June, so that's what, 8 months.
8 months, yeah.
Then he'll catch him. If Glover hasn't lost a step and he has what he had against Yuri, he's probably going to be too crafty, too balanced a fighter, and he'll probably be able to get those takedowns and either stop Hill on the ground or just kind of stifle his offense. If it stays on the feet, Hill's too good. Hill's arguably better than Yuri, although maybe not. Not as an orthodox, but his boxing skills are really polished. So he's got a shot here. Odds makers are making, I think they're making Hill favorite. Let me take a look here, because I think I saw that and I was surprised.
Last I checked, Hill was a slight favorite.
Yeah. So they're looking at the age, and they're looking also that Hill is probably the A side of this. UFC probably doesn't want a 43-year-old to keep winning fights, because he's at any time he can retire. They would much rather have a 31-year-old exciting young guy
Right.
win fights. So I think that and it seems like the judges, who I really feel should not think about this. Some of the decisions make it seem like the judges are thinking about that too. It's almost like if these rounds are close, we're going to give them to Jamal.
Give it to the younger guy. What worries me about Glover Teixeira is not only his age, but how active he's actually been despite his age. And this even 8 months of inactivity, as you mentioned, after going through a slobber knocker war with Yuri Prohaska, how his body is going to respond to that, let alone the fact that, you know, 2 of the worst knockouts I've ever seen, unfortunately, Glover Teixeira was on the receiving end of both of them. Anthony Rumble Johnson, the late great Anthony Rumble Johnson, one of the nicest guys of all time, gone way too soon. And Alexander Gustafsson knocked out Glover Teixeira as well. Those were 2 uppercuts that landed that sent Glover Teixeira down. But that same Glover Teixeira did get back up and did win the UFC light heavyweight title. So and had a great performance against Anthony Smith, who I mentioned earlier, that it was almost like a grown up on a youngster. You know, like
he big brothered him. He big brothered him.
Yeah, exactly. So you never know which Glover Teixeira you're gonna get in that turn, you know, in that respect. But there is something about, maybe it's because when I saw Randy Couture beat Chuck Liddell all those years ago when Tito was holding out and was filming some movies and he wasn't fighting Chuck Liddell and there was all that stuff going on, and Chuck Liddell said, "I'll fight Randy Couture if you guys want me to," and then Randy beats Chuck Liddell. Maybe that is what makes me want to root for the older guy, and maybe that makes me want to root for Glover Teixeira anytime he steps out into the octagon, which usually I am. So I'm kind of rooting for Glover Teixeira in this one to just win one for the older guys. You know, like let's keep this going. I love that when the older guys win. It's awesome. So I don't know. I'm going Glover.
Absolutely, and I'm nice. I think you could be right. I'm Generation X. Glover is like right on that border, depending on where people put it. But he's either like just made Generation X in the last year, or he's like the oldest millennial that you could beat. So he's right on that. He's right on that line. And either way, I like cheering for older guys. I've interviewed Jamal several times. He's from Illinois, but he's representing Michigan, my original home state.
That's awesome.
I hate to cheer against him. I know him. He's a cool dude. He's up against it here against Hill. He really is. I think that Hill's going to be. If Hill wins, if Glover wins, we might see the first UFC champion to win a title and put his belt down and his gloves in the cage, because it would be the second time. He'd be 44 by the next time he fights, and it would be kind of cool and unique to do that, for him to thank everyone, to have Dana put the belt around him, and then actually to have someone in his corner take it off of him and put it on the ground with his gloves. I don't think I've ever seen that. That would be sick, wouldn't it?
I would shed a tear. We were close to the possibility of that happening with Dan Henderson when he got the title shot against Michael Bisping.
And I thought he won. And I like Michael. I've interviewed Michael and Dan, but I thought he won. I know that would have been so great if Dan would have done that. Yeah, Dan is a tough guy. I actually said this on a podcast where I was talking to John Fitch that I did the other day, where I said,
"How's he doing? How's John Fitch
John's
doing?"
Great. He's doing
That's
great.
Awesome.
He's killing it. And Fitch is a tough guy in his own right. But he even agreed with me on this. And I said, I'll throw this out, then we can wrap it up. I know people don't want to hear my voice too much longer, probably. But a lot of you don't realize that even if you train jiu-jitsu, or if you train Muay Thai, or done maybe like a little bit of karate, or maybe a small amount of boxing, and you feel like, maybe you're just as tough as these guys that have done MMA for 10, 15, 20 years. I never had a big ego like that, but I trained martial arts from a very young age. Was learning jiu-jitsu from the beginning, but didn't stay in it that long, and some Muay Thai, and I never really wrestled, but I knew people that did, and respected that. But I there you go. But when I went to an MMA fight about 20 years ago, and got to see Dan Henderson in person. He was the first MMA fighter that I saw in person. And television, I'm telling you guys, television, if you haven't seen a guy like that in person, television makes him look kind of like you and me. But when you're right near a guy like that and you see the scar tissue on him and the ears and how rugged a guy he is, you feel like, I remember I was looking at him, I was like, fuck. Sorry if you can't swear. So,
no, you're good. You're good.
I appreciate it. But I remember thinking, I really feel like I could walk behind this guy and hit him as hard as I could, or kick him in the head, and it wouldn't hurt him. I mean, he just seemed like such a much more rugged individual than you see walking down the street or at any gym where you're training, and it kind of gave me a proper respect for a guy who's been in the fire like that for a long time. And so,
one of the best to ever do it.
Right. And even Fitch said that. Right. Sorry. Yep. Yeah. And even Fitch said, yeah. He said, you see Dan Henderson in person. He said, you feel that way. He said, he shows a difference. Really, he's not the tallest guy in the world, but you walk up and look at Dan Henderson, the average guy, even if you're big, strong, and young, will see things that will make you say, maybe you just leave this guy alone. Maybe if I was thinking of doing something, maybe just say, excuse me, sir, I thought you were my uncle, and you're not, so never mind.
I love that. If you're at a bar and one guy bumps into you and it's Dan Henderson, you just leave. Hand him your beer and you leave.
That's it. You say, you know what, my girlfriend's calling. I actually have to be home really, really quick. I'm sorry, dude. I would fight with you. I really would, but I can't do it now. I'm very busy. Sorry.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love that. That's an awesome way to end the show, talking about Dan Henderson. Oh man, that's one of my favorites. One of my favorite fighters of all time. Colin Crandall, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me, Colin. We talked a wide array of topics. I feel much more educated. I thought I knew everything. I learned about Big John McCarthy, learned about the old days of the sport. Pretty awesome stuff, Colin. I really appreciate you hopping on, buddy.
My pleasure, Ryan. I hope I didn't talk too much for you, but
you're good.
Thank you.
It was great.
You have me on. I know that when I interview people, I always hope that at least if they're going to be one way or the other, not talking enough are talking too much. As an interviewer, you figure always better if they talk too much.
It is.
So that,
It
you
is.
know, right? So we don't have to
For
pull stuff
sure.
out of them. So
For
I
sure.
appreciate it. And
Thank
yes,
you.
my pleasure, man. I really enjoyed it. And honestly, let me know, man. You got a professional show. You're an amazing interviewer and a great guy. Anytime you need me down the line, hit me up. I'll be happy to come on.
I'll definitely take you up on that. I really appreciate the kind words and the compliments. Thank you so much for hopping on with me, and enjoy the fights, right?
I will. You too, my friend. We'll stay in touch.
Stay in touch. Take care, Colin.
You too, Ryan. Have a great one.
You too. That was Colin Crandall of the MMA Power Hour joining me, Ryan Thomas, on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast tonight. We talked about a lot of stuff, learned a lot of stuff in regards to mixed martial arts. Some of it was a great history lesson. I mean, in terms of where the sport has come to where it is today, and what better way to end the show than talking about one of the toughest SOBs on the planet, Dan Henderson, one of my favorite fighters of all time. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Enjoy the fights.